Hello, welcome to Painting 2. This presentation is in regard to your first out-of-class project, Everyday Phenomenon. This presentation is meant to be a supplemental info session to the assignment sheet that you can find in our course website through Canvas. So you'll find more details on the project there. The basic idea with this project is that I'm going to ask you to paint a diary of sorts, to paint every day, and to come up with a single subject or series of interrelated subjects that will inform at least 9 paintings in this series. We're thinking of it as one big project, but you're going to make multiple images within it. That presents several difficulties for you to overcome. The first one being that you'll have to figure out how to make a single idea interesting enough to be worthy of multiple pieces. And I think that can be a real challenge when you're first getting started. So I want you to try and think about what drew you to these subjects in the first place, why you found them interesting, and what you think you can highlight for the viewer that they might agree with you. Second, it will create the problem of just challenging you to paint every day, which is like any other habit, like working out or eating well or anything like that, is difficult at first, and then the more that you do it, the more it becomes a part of your routine. So without further ado, let's get started. The first artist I'd like to talk a little bit about today is an American artist named Via Selmans. Selmans has made a long career of working primarily in a photorealistic method. And when I say photorealism, I mean she is actually working from photographs a lot of the time, really making studious use of that photographic image. But these first couple paintings I'm going to show you are from earlier than that. These are from the 1960s. And in these pieces, Selmans found an object from her own studio and then isolated it for us to view. And I love this as a project for Everyday Phenomenon because as a studio artist, we often are working alone and are kind of just surrounded by our own little weird world that we've created. And those objects that you find in your studio are often a mixture of useful or tchotchkes, like little toys or things that have caught your eye, perhaps a piece of garbage that you found on the sidewalk that you thought was really cool looking and you brought it into the studio. Maybe you meant to paint it, and then there it sits years later. And Selmans is kind of like isolated a couple of those objects, and it really gives us this sense of kind of interest and almost melancholy. I just find them very moving, as in the loneliest space heater in the world. Here's another image from that same series by Via Selmans. This is a lamp from her studio. Like I've already said, this kind of isolation is really apparent in this, but a couple other painterly modes or methods that I want you to kind of be aware of when looking at this piece. Number one, this is almost an achromatic painting. There's a little bit of color inside the temperature changes in the grays. You'll notice kind of a greenish or orangish gray that's on the base of the lamp compared to a purplish, more neutral up inside the lamp shade. But then on top of color, we also see this really smart spatial move where Selmans has allowed the cord or the cable of the lamp to move forward in space to break over the lip of that little ad hoc shelf she has built in her studio. It's a really smart move. You see this in tons of still life paintings going all the way back to the Renaissance and before, wherein something in the still life kind of presses up against the picture plane, getting closer to us, the viewer, and creating a sense of space between us and that. Speaking of the picture plane, when we're confronted by this drawing by Via Selmans, it is a graphite piece, a drawing of a photograph of a bombed out structure. We're really, I just can't imagine how better she could have done this. I mean, it's very gracefully drawn, but on top of that, just the simple choice to have it be an object itself, the photograph an object, torn out and placed on the table in a trompe-l'oeil or fool the eye fashion. It creates so much distance and so much honesty about where we are in relationship to that image. This is, of course, an older image, and we are now twice removed from it. She's also being very upfront about the fact that she's working from a photograph by actually showing us the edges of this found object, almost like sampling. In music, she is taking something from somewhere else, remixing it, and then placing it in front of us in a new way. Something to consider for yourself if you are drawn to the idea of using images in your daily life as part of this project, either from online or from your favorite books or from your favorite TV shows or video games. How can you honestly present those found images to us in a new way? This is the last slide I'll show by Via Selmans. This is very indicative of a lot of the work that you'll see of hers if you are to encounter one out in the world at a museum or something like that. This is a painting from a photograph of the sea near where she lives. And I think what I really want to draw your attention to on this is the way that this feels very personal. Even though it's kind of this cold image, very kind of far away, we are seeing the seascape the way that the artist saw the seascape. Because she has rendered it in this very studious, really concerted effort, we in turn feel that studiousness inside the image. It's very different than how I might paint a seascape or you might paint a seascape. It's very different than how a photograph would maybe depict this, even the original source photograph to begin with. Because of that hand, we can feel the time and the effort that went into it. This is a way that you might think about finding your diaristic practice, your everyday phenomenon that you're going to work from, and how you might bring something specific to that. The next artist I'll speak on is Susanna Coffey. Um, Coffey has, among other things, used self-portraiture as a way to create meaning and content in her work over many years. Um, One of the great things about self-portraiture, or using your own image in your paintings, is that you are always there. You are an ever-present model. You'll do whatever you say. You'll sit for as long as you like, as many photos as you like, and you can wear whatever stupid thing you can think to put on you. So you might consider yourself as one of your objects, if we want to call it that, that is at your disposal for this project. Now, Susanna Coffey, you're going to see through the course of the next few images that I show that she uses her visage, her own face, not really as a study in what she looks like or the anatomy of her skull, but instead as like a prop in a narrative that is about how we view that painting. In this one, notice that she's lit from very austerely from the top down. That's pretty common in some of the images I'll show you, but so much so that we can almost like not see her eyes, which is almost horrific or kind of scary. And then, of course, she is in this kind of blue urban camo, surrounded by this atmospheric landscape blue painting, almost melancholic. Her head kind of tilts down a little bit, but it's somewhat inscrutable. Is she sad? Are we meant to be sad by it? She emerges from that blue background in a kind of particularly interesting way, but she's also smack in the middle of the image, which is kind of odd. In this piece by Susanna Coffey, you can see that the light from this fire in the background has now influenced the light source on Coffey's face. She's a little bit more defiant than in the previous image. Her head is tilted up. Her eyes are still just barely open, barely visible inside that almost kind of skull-like shape around her eyes. So is this sad? Is this post-apocalyptic? Or is she almost defiant? I mean, she has a hat on backwards. Could she have been the one who set the fire in the background, or perhaps who wishes that she had set the fire? Think about the ways in which this figure now, although being a self-portrait, is solely existing so that to create this kind of ambiguous, open-ended narrative for us as the viewers to try and pick apart. A really interesting concept for you to consider in your own work. Here we have two more final pieces by Coffey. The image on the left, she almost floats in this kind of sea of little marks, very dark, much more serene than the other two images. I want to point that out. As her head tilts back, she feels almost more relaxed. And now that kind of cap that she's wearing almost becomes like a swim cap or something. And then the image on the right is so different. It's very pink, it's very bright. The chroma, the saturation of the color is very intense. And all of that leads to almost being funny or fun. It's way more laid back of a painting. So think about the ways in which you can take a single subject and spread across just some of your basic formal ideas: composition, lighting, value, contrast, color chroma, and saturation. And think about how much that impacts the way that we view those pieces. The English painter John Constable was a romantic painter, worked in the early 1800s, and he's very well known for a huge series of landscape paintings. You encounter him at the Met and, of course, the Royal Gallery in London. But some of my favorites of his have always been these cloud studies that are done very quickly. And in this case, actually on cardboard, you can see the little scumbling effect over across the top of that image as the paintbrush scrapes dryly across the texture of the straight striations of cardboard across the top. And one of the reasons I love these cloud pieces is that they're done very, very quickly, which is one of the things that you would have to do if you were painting clouds. Clouds move and clouds change, and before the advent of photography, we couldn't still them in place. In fact, clouds have famously been very difficult to paint. Supposedly, Fra Angelico painted clouds by holding up a little clump of cotton, like a cotton ball, to the light and imagining it was a cloud. And then that's how he kind of worked that space in there. So I love this idea of painting something that's very ephemeral. It's changing as you're working from it. And so you yourself have to make decisions, quick decisions that allow you to move on to the next one. Like we talked about with other paintings in this series, please pay attention to the way that the space that you're painting creates distance for the viewer. Notice how different it is because there's that little bit of plant down in there and how much the space changes. Another piece by Constable, this one very far away, almost as if we're viewing the landscape out over the ocean or over a Great Plains, very distant in the sky. And so you might think a little bit about how the subject that you choose perhaps in this case, it's not even an object. It's actually like a weather-based phenomenon, like clouds or the play of light across the sky. I'll finish with this one, which might be my favorite that I've shown you. Notice that it starts with a burnt sienna undertone wash, and then that allows Constable to build up the layers of value, light and dark, on top of that to create these little areas of clouds that are in or out of the light source. And then, of course, we have this really vibrant light in the top left that implies that the sun is right behind that darkened cloud. The Italian artist Giorgio Morandi worked for most of, maybe all of his career, on boxes and bottles. And if you're like me, boxes and bottles probably don't mean that much to you. They're very banal subject matter, boring, you might even say. And yet, Morandi's insistence on focusing on these really mundane objects allowed him to create a whole lot of meaning by working from them. Let's talk about some of those decisions. In this piece, Morandi places the bottles and boxes into almost a ridiculously stupid framing. He breaks almost every rule that you or I would ever use to set up an interesting still life. He uses boring objects, and then he lines them up in a way that almost doesn't differentiate between them. All the bottles are smashed together. All the tops of the boxes are lined up into a straight line. All the tops of the bottles in that pitcher are all lined up into the context of the straight line. And then they're sandwiched smack dab in the middle of this square canvas. Everything in it is insinuating flatness. Even Mirandi's signature, smack dab in the middle across the bottom of that piece, just seems to identify it as an abstract, flattened painting. And isn't that the point? Morandi isn't as interested in these bottles as he is in them as subjects to discuss what it means to make a painting, what it means to take flatness and surface and infuse it with a liquid goop and turn it into something interesting to look at. Here's a couple more examples from Morandi. Now on the left, we have these kind of bottles again smashed together into a signature kind of square right in the middle. Notice that Morandi has again signed it in the middle of the piece. Now the boxes right behind the bottles have allowed for this kind of negative space to be approached. And on the image on the right, we have a little bit more traditional diagonals that we might use for a little bit more dynamic setup. We have cast shadows on the table, a different piece, but you'll notice the same kind of approach to treating these objects not as precious, but instead as simply items to kind of explore what it means to make space and light and surface in a painting. The American painter Chuck Close said of Giorgio Morandi, I sure don't care. Actually, I think he said, I sure don't give a damn about boxes and bottles, but I'm sure glad that Giorgio Morandi did. And I think that that's really what I'm trying to convey to you with these images, is that you can pick something kind of boring or something that doesn't seem to have a lot of meaning, and you can force a lot of meaning into it by the way that you choose to paint it. When you choose to create a little bit of like tangible realism through modeling of light and dark, like Morandi does in that black bottle on the left, we almost feel like we could reach out and peel it out of that flattened space. Or how all these kind of awkward, rubbery, soft shapes mesh together in the image on the right, where there's almost a sense of humor to it all. I want you to think about the objects that you choose and how the ways in which you encounter them as a maker infuse them with meaning and content. One last one by Giorgio Morandi. This one, an etching. You could think of it almost like a pen and ink drawing, since you were in the absence of a printing press, but just using grays and white and just a series of cross hatching to create this like little spacing of all this stuff piled onto a table. The Portland-based artist Dan Atto has made just a ton of work throughout a whole variety of different subject matter, including neon lights and installation work and sculpture. But it's his paintings of swimming pools that I want to draw your attention to right now, because he's come back to this theme multiple times. And I think that there's something really just kind of magical and Pacific Northwesty about that idea. This glowing body of water with these kind of small figures, very miniaturized by the giantness of the landscape around them. And that just feels really particular to the place that we live. In this one, the figures are no longer there. The sun is starting to come up, and all that's left are these floating little remnants, perhaps rafts or the swimsuits still left over from the night before. In this detail, you can see that Atto often writes text into his work. In this case, it reads, "Everything I did was planned." Is that a statement of like a captioning, like something about the way that the thing itself was painted, or is that coming from the artist Dan Atto, or is that like a word bubble, like from a comic book of this figure standing and looking at these other two frolicking in the space? That kind of ambiguity leaves open the narrative for us to kind of decide later on. The artist Anne Craven has, like many of these artists, has worked in a huge variety of media, of subjects. But her paintings of the moon are particularly interesting, I think, in that they take an observed phenomenon, the moon, every night from on top of her studio, kind of like Thomas Woodruff's apples. But unlike Woodruff, they're not all directly observed from the moon. She paints every night, say for a month, and then she takes those 30 paintings back into her studio and she copies them. She makes another version of them, perhaps a little bigger, scaling up, a little smaller, scaling down, or some kind of duplicate, once again, kind of giving herself almost like an assignment to keep working from this project as she goes. Interesting idea. And then once we see them all clustered together, we're really confronted by the scale of the idea. This is kind of repetition of night, the magic of the changing phases of the moon, and how she as an artist interacts with them one after another. Another one by Craven. This is from that same series. And just a little up close, you can kind of see some of her painterly choices that she's making. They're very quick, they're off the cuff. I imagine she's not spending a ton of time on each one of these paintings, but as they stack together, we start to get a sense of the scale of the project. One final one by Craven. Again, look at the way that she's hanging them, even choosing to hang them on the wall. It makes it so that the mass of them, we're not really reading them top to bottom or left to right. We're looking at the numbers here and how many of them she's made. And that's what allows our eye to kind of skip across, linger on one that really catches our eye, perhaps one with a halo around the moon, or perhaps one that the trees are blocking the way. And we kind of get a sense of what drew her eye that night and how truthful or not truthful she was to the subject that she was seeing at the time. I'm going to finish with just a few student images from work from many years ago when I first was starting to teach this project. And these are a little old, but I think that they still really work pretty well for this project. And I just want to also point out that you can see an entire other slideshow of student work on Canvas to give you, that's a lot more contemporary, that will give you some of the ideas of how some of your peers elected to complete this project. So here we go. In this series of paintings, the artist picked this like greasiest, grossest fast food you can imagine, just greasy French fries and like an Arby's roast beef and cheddar, just disgusting, sitting in its grease. And again, like, I don't really care about the subject matter that much. I don't care about French fries or a sandwich, but I do care about the way that these have been depicted. They're so interesting and so gross and so exciting all at the same time. The way that they just kind of smear across the surface of these panels it feels really tied together to the subject itself and becomes a really interesting series of paintings. Here's how that artist chose to present them. And one final image, this time of up-close shots of the artist's friends smiling or posing for her to work from. You'll notice that some of these images are almost photorealistic. Some of them are a lot flatter and more cartoony. I suspect that some of that may have come from just the need to paint every day and to complete the project. She likely chose pieces that were a little faster to make compared to some that took a little longer based on her actual abilities at the time that she was making the work. And I just want to finish by saying that is completely okay. You should do that. Make your decisions based on each one of those.